Jim's coming
Raise
to
your
us.
hand. We are still experiencing Wednesday, April 16th here, and it is 2:00. We are, as folks might remember, before crossover, we did some work on the pilot special fund. And some questions came up about how pilot payments are calculated. And so we are going to take some testimony on that today by starting with Ted Barnett from the Joint Fiscal Office. Would you like to join us, sir?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
That's funny.
Yeah, that's what.
Oh, Ted Barnett, Joint Fiscal Office. Chris told me about this amazing trick where you could click share when you're over there and then it's ready when you sit into the chair. And this is like game changing in my life because I'm just ready to go and I don't have to fumble around. So, yes, for the record, Ted Barnett, Joint Fiscal Office, PowerPoint ready to go. It's the little things. But I have to hit full screen first. Okay. So really general review, within Vermont, there are two pilot programs. Pilot stands for payment in lieu of taxes. And both programs are designed to compensate municipalities for the value of state-owned land or property that is otherwise exempt from property taxes. So there's the general pilot program, which compensates municipalities for the assessed value of buildings, with a slight asterisk for correctional facilities that does include the value of underlying land. The general pilot program is funded through 30% of local option tax revenue, minus $5.96 per return fee that is remitted to the Department of Taxes for administering local option taxes. This percentage split was established by Act 215 of 2005, so it's been in place for quite a while. The A&R pilot program compensates towns for the value of land that is purchased for conservation. 80% of that funding comes from the general fund, 20% from the Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Which is funded through the general fund.
It's an interdepartmental transfer. And so, yes, it's in total. It's in the same, it's an appropriation, and it has its own B section, 701 of the FY26 budget. I use these splits because that is the way it's presented in the A&R website. And so, yes, for that program, in the FY26 budget, there was a $2.7 million appropriation attached to it. I'm going to start with the A&R pilot calculation because I'm going to spend a lot more time with the general pilot calculations and spend a little time with how the CLA intersects with the general pilot calculation. The A&R pilot calculation works as followed. So for land that was acquired before April 1 of 2016, it's 0.6% of fair market value of fair market value as appraised by PVR in April 1st, 2015. So the formula is below. If that property is required after April 1st, 2016, the base payment is determined by using the land value and the tax rate that was in effect at the time of acquisition. Right, because you have land that was acquired by the state decades and decades and decades ago. This was there's an evolving process of bringing A&R pilot calculations to kind of a consistent methodology. And so this was the system that was determined around that time. There is statute that gives the secretary a mandate to recommend an adjustment consistent with statewide municipal tax rates or other appropriate indicators every 3 to 5 years.
How often do you know if that happens?
So it happened in 2022. The adjustment was 1.29%. So
Across the board.
Across the board. So all of these base payments are fixed. They don't adjust year to year unless that increase goes into effect. And so, yes, the next adjustment is scheduled to occur 2025 between now and 2027. And so that would happen as a part of the budget request process.
And so that only, you said scheduled to occur, but that only happens at the request of the A&R secretary and then as part of the budget process.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Exactly. And so,
Representative Feltus.
Yes. I'm a bit confused by the comment that it is for land purchased or acquired for conservation.
Mhm.
I was under the understanding that it was for just basically any land owned by A&R, owned or controlled.
that is a good question. Let me get into, like, I could follow up with more specific, the phrasing that is used on the, like, A&R uses the phrasing purchase for conservation. I can certainly, if, Niels, Reinhardt is a contact I have there, I could ask him about, if there's a distinction between purchase by conservation or just owned generally. And I'm not sure.
And they
Yeah.
might or might not be joining us later in this testimony.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Representative Bodie.
Will it come up later? What about land underneath the buildings? And what about non-state-owned buildings? Is that later in the presentation?
So non-state-owned buildings wouldn't be a part of the pilot count process, but as an example, if you have a state park, the underlying land in that state park would be part of the calculation. If there are lean-tos or campground facilities or buildings on that land, that would be a part of the general pilot payment, which we are going to go into in more detail.
But there's an entirely different pilot structure for like a downtown building than there is for a state-owned land, right?
For state-owned land, yes.
Yeah,
Um,
we're gonna talk about that whole other thing later.
I'm getting that, but
Okay.
I thought, like, what about a hospital?
So a hospital, if that's not state-owned, there's no pilot payment. They would pay normal, they'd be assessed by the municipality, pay municipal tax rates. They'd be a part of that whole process.
I guess I would offer, in my experience in my own municipality, there are large nonprofits in my community who own large buildings and land who pay something that they call a pilot payment.
Right.
But that is using the acronym in its more casual shortening of payment in lieu of taxes, but it's not a technical term the same way we use it in statute.
Exactly.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It reminded me, I thought, well, what's going
Yes.
on? Okay.
I think that's about, I think that's the will of the payer and not a statutory requirement.
That's right. Okay.
Back to you, Ted.
Sure. So within the general pilot payment, so talking about state-owned buildings, they're kind of thought of within two buckets. One is a general pilot payment. This includes the $750,000 statutory cap on the value of UVM buildings. And then there is a separate kind of set of payments for correctional facilities. There are two payments within that, $152,000 in section B 338 for correctional facilities in Newport and Springfield, and then $40,000 for other ones in B 144. And the high general pilot payments, so this is not including correctional facilities, totaled 11.25 million in fiscal year 2024. This is the first time that the pilot program had been fully funded. Previously, payments have been prorated based on the revenues that were available. And so going straight into how the payment is calculated, the method is outlined in statute. This is 32 VSA 3703. And so the payment is based on the total assessed value of state-owned property in a municipality multiplied by the CLA, which is different than how the CLA operates for calculating education property taxes. Multiplied by 1% to get the grand list value, and multiplied by the adjusted municipal tax rate for the municipality in which the property is located. So to provide a little more context for some of those terms, the total assessed value is statutorily defined. It is based on insurance replacement value, not fair market value. For correctional facilities, as I mentioned earlier, it includes the value of land. This is a, I'm pretty sure on the state building inventory, 115 State Street is where we are in the State House. And so the value of that is $32.9 million on the state building inventory. It's just slightly more of 133 State, which is just north of $32 million. So I thought that was fun. The CLA, as I noted, want to flag again that property values within the pilot program are multiplied by the CLA to derive the local value of state-owned property.
I find that to be so profoundly confusing, and I wondered if you see a logic in it that you could explain to me.
The way, and I am going to look to Jake to see, so the way I understand it is that you have the insurance replacement values are kind of state values. In order to make those state level values match the local values a municipal grand list as they're maintained, because this is driving a municipal calculation, you need to use the CLA to essentially make those match by multiplying, because in the flip side, to make all municipal values match at the statewide level, you're dividing. So it's just flipping that, because you're bringing the calculation, essentially you're doing the reverse calculation to make state values work at the local level.
But if, from a logic standpoint, if you assume that the insurance replacement value is market value, then why use the CLA at all?
So again, you have towns that are, their grand lists haven't been reappraised in a while. And so their grand lists aren't necessarily reflective of statewide fair market value.
Right, and that gives reason for the CLA, but the insurance estimate should be regardless of that.
Well,
Let's have the conversation again with
Right.
Jake and see if we get any further.
Sorry. Sorry, Ted.
No, it's totally fine. So, and then finally, we have the final term is the adjusted municipal tax rate. So this is taking the total sum of money that was voted by the municipality for their non-education expenses divided by the adjusted municipal grand list, which includes that insurance value of state-owned buildings. So yeah, you divide it by the, so in the same rate, right? You need to raise a certain amount of money using your tax rate to raise enough money to meet what has been voted on as in the municipal budget. So if it's helpful to see these instead of entirely in words in more of equation format, right? We have our total value of assessed value of state buildings multiplied by the CLA, multiplied by 1%, gives you your state-owned additions to the grand list. The second piece is figuring out the adjusted municipal tax rate. So that's looking at the total amount of tax revenue raised divided by the adjusted municipal grand list, which is the grand list plus your state-owned additions. And then taking those state-owned additions, multiplying them by the municipal tax rate is giving you your pilot payment. So this is basically trying to understand if those state-owned buildings were operating like every other building within the municipal grand list, if they weren't exempt, how would your tax rates be figured and how much would the value of those buildings be as a part of that process? Talking a bit more about insurance replacement value, I know Jill and Jake will go into more detail. There could be some administrative advantages. So rather than these values are maintained by the agency of administration, by a contractor. These values are available. So this would remove some complex valuation tasks, having localities figure out the value of a biodigester facility in Randolph, for example. So this, and it includes the value of buildings by default. So insurance replacement is looking at the value of buildings. And so in an example where you have an A&R pilot program, which is looking at land, and you want to look at buildings only, and if that's the design of the program, you have something that's using only the value of buildings. And there may be differences.
Let's back up.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say, well, this building that we're on
Mhm.
in. It's just the actual building, so all of the like lovely front lawnness, which might have its own actual value since it's right downtown and.
Right, that is not part of the,
Nice. So that's not part of the pilot payment at all.
right, because it's insurance replacement value and it's the value of what it would cost to replace
And
that
the
building.
land underneath it is not valued at the A&R rate either.
Not as far, I
Okay.
would want to, but it's not my understanding that that's part of that payment.
But if, okay, and then if, say, I feel like a lot of state houses might be on a bit more land and the land around it, like the White House, is considered a national park, I think. So maybe then that land would be, so, but I'm overthinking this and I'm gonna go back to you now and stop talking.
Sure. And I just saw that someone from FPR entered, and so maybe they'll be able to clarify that question. Yep. And so replacement values and fair market values may not always line up. There's replacement values and fair market values might be different for a whole variety of factors. For example, I live in a very old house, and so the replacement value of the insurance replacement value of my house is higher than the listed value because to rebuild at current rates would be more than what the town lists it at. So moving on to CLAs, and I know there have been some examples of towns that have noticed that their pilot payment have gone down. And I wanted to show how this operates. So Johnson is an example. They host a Vermont State College campus, or Vermont State University, excuse me. And so in fiscal year 24, their assessed value of state-owned buildings was $86 million. Their CLA was 89.67%. And so when you work that through the calculations, their payment was almost $500,000. In fiscal year 25, their CLA went from 89.67% to 74% with the same amount of value in state-owned buildings. And so their pilot payment went down by $47,205. And so this is more likely to occur in towns that have, from what I understand, the insurance replacement values of Vermont State University campuses may not be updated every year. So when your values aren't increasing, CLAs are dropping, and you may not have much growth in the town grand list. This is more likely to occur, but it is a function because it is a part of that calculation of trends in pilot payments. In fiscal year 25, so taking the weighted average of CLAs, they were 77.4%. Of the 161 total FY25 payments, 144 were adjusted by CLA less than or equal to 90. And of the CLAs that decreased between 2022 and 2023, the average decrease was 10.7 percentage points. We're seeing sharp drops in CLAs. Based on 2025 data, removing the CLA from the pilot calculation would increase payments by $3 million, right? Since your weighted average of CLAs was 77.4%, if you were to remove that piece of the calculation, payments would increase. And this estimate could understate the impact of the CLA as we're seeing high rates of real estate depreciation. I did want to make the point, one of the features of the pilot system, right, is there's not a direct overlap between the source of revenue, which is lot towns, and who's receiving pilot payments. So on the left, this is a snip directly from Vermont Department of Taxes local option tax page. And so it shows all the town borders that are in green. Those have a local option tax on sales and meals and rooms taxes. Yellow just is the meals and rooms portion. There's a few blues in there, like Rutland City. Those are just sales. Purple are rooms, and then red is meals and alcohol only, which is South Hero. And so there are 34 towns with local option taxes. And these are primarily clustered around ski areas. You see a lot in southern Vermont. You see some in and around kind of the ski areas in central Vermont here, and then also in Chittenden County. Whereas municipalities that receive a pilot payment are spread all across the state. You see clusters in towns with large state presence, obviously, and Vermont State University locations. But there are far more towns that receive a payment than those that send it. Though I would note that the payments in a lot of these cases are relatively small.
Does the map on the left of the lot towns include the 5 that passed this last town meeting?
I would look, it should be updated since they went through, but I would look to the folks at Department of Taxes to, well, let's see, it would be Ludlow would be an example. There would
I
be
think Hartford.
Hartford would be another, which should be right there.
That's fiscal year.
Okay.
Going back through history and talking a bit about the trends and the relationship between pilot special fund revenue and expenses, and talking about our proration. After there was a fund deficit in fiscal year 14, there were a few years where the pilot special fund built up a bit of balance, but then between fiscal years 17 and 21, you see a pretty close relationship between revenue and expenses. I remember my first session here seeing a spreadsheet that was really trying to understand who was enacting a local option tax, relying on the revenue forecast for sales and meals and rooms, and understanding really how to get to that proration of the appropriation. And so these were pretty closely aligned. And so the fund balance of approximately $4 million stayed consistent throughout that time. As I've shared with the committee before, and it's in the issue brief as well, starting in fiscal year 22, you start to see gaps between revenue and expenses. This is explained both by the number of new towns implementing local option taxes and also some post-pandemic trends in sales and meals and rooms tax. Those tax types performed quite well post-pandemic, and so really started to see more revenue accruing to the pilot special fund. And so the surplus within the fund has increased substantially. Fiscal year 21, it was $4 million, and then at a close of fiscal year 24, it was over $10 million. The table on the right just shows the difference between the full pilot payment and prorated pilot payments, and showing that over time, up until fiscal year 23, folks receiving pilot payments on the whole were receiving, before fiscal year 21, it was above $2 million between what the calculations would have delivered them and what they were able to receive through those prorated payments. And then this is in combination, this table is from the 397 fiscal note. Within that bill, there is an adjustment of the pilot special fund. The share between what municipalities get, what the pilot special fund gets. And so that adjustment would leave $14 million in the fund if it were to be enacted. And reminding the committee that in total, in H 493, which there the various appropriations from the pilot special fund, which include the base general pilot payment, correctional pilot payments, and the $1 million for the municipal grand list stabilization program, totals $13.392 million. So were those changes all to happen in sequence and together, right? You're looking at revenue, an estimated revenue of $14 million in fiscal year 26, and or appropriations of almost $13.4 million. So there's some room there. And that's it. That is what I've prepared for y'all.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Representative Woody?
Yes, I have a comment. About what to do about whether to increase what is given out from that fund.
Oh,
It's the right time to say it or not.
yeah, I don't know if it's a question on the table, since we already passed that language over to the Senate. And I did invite the League of Cities and Towns to join us today, and none of them were available to join us. But feel free to read your.
After this presentation, I thought, well, it might be more fair to take a greater pilot payment earlier. Because as more towns institute the LOT, they'll share the bounty of that extra in the savings account without having contributed to that funding portion or over time. It's just a thought.
Are you talking about increasing the pilot payment, not increasing the
I'm
ratio?
Increasing taking out from the savings, the extra fund, it's in the fund.
As pilot payments or as a different ratio of local option tax?
As a pilot payment.
Thank you. Representative Felton.
Yes, I'd like to, can we go back to the insurance value of buildings, please? It says that the Agency of Administration has a contractor who reviews it. I guess there's always been a concern, at least in my town, that the insurance value is not really a fair market value. And I know you went through the calculation of how to use the CLA and that sort of thing. But I guess the question we have often had is how often is that insurance value reviewed? And is it indeed accurate in terms of an insurance replacement value? As I'm not sure they could building for 32 million. So how does that jive with using that as a benchmark for the value of the building?
Sure.
Compensate.
And I know the insurance values are adjusted yearly. I know the Department of Taxes is going to go into more detail on insurance replacement values and how they are used, and they probably have a better view on insurance replacement values. I see how they show up in the calculation and on the pilot spreadsheets, but I do know they're updated every year.
I just have the doubt that it's truly a replacement value. Which I guess is just a comment.
Yes. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Representative Maslin.
Yes, thank you. Brief historical perspective. I was on the League of City Towns board when these pilot payment first came apart. We're not getting anything. This is the municipality stuff. Let's set up this program so we finally get something. And so I find Ted's calculations very interesting. From historical perspective, anything's better than nothing. And so I'm not going to be the one to pick through the calculations, even though I appreciate those who do that exercise. It's just, it's so much better than when towns got nothing, really. So it's just some grist for the mill members, that's all.
And again, I'm not planning on us making many decisions this week. We're just talking about stuff. That were pressing issues that have come up before, but that we don't have vehicles for these decisions. It's just-
Right, no,
We're gonna
I'm
dive
just
deeper, yes.
curious about the mechanics.
No, I find it incredibly confusing myself.
Exactly how that's done and what's the justification.
Aaron and Jake, are you together?
Okay.
Would you like to join us? However, meets your needs. I have no preferences.
School board members too.
It's been a hard time to get her today.
We have a meeting tonight? Wow.
Good afternoon. My name is Jill Remick. I'm the Director of Property Valuation and Review at the Tax Department.
Jake Feldman, Senior Fiscal Analyst, Tax Department.
All right, where to begin? So we prepared a few things, sort of having some sense of what you folks are looking for, but we're happy to sort of field any questions that come up. I have a couple little things that we pulled together in case it's helpful to sort of illustrate the sort of history of the pilot calculations and where we're at now. As Ted pointed out, this current year and last fiscal year were the very first times they were actually 100% fully funded. In 2015, so 10 years ago, they were at 68% funded. So that's moving in the right direction. I did want to point out about the, ready to share yet, so. Okay. So the CLA being applied to the insurance value. So we do something very similar with utility valuation because they're revalued every year. So the way I think about it is there's a tenant in assessment called sales chasing, where you're not supposed to reassess something at fair market value out of alignment with the rest of the town. So if we're establishing a value for this subset differently, then we really do sort of need to make that time adjustment to make sure that it's sort of on level playing field with the rest of the town realized values.
That worked for my brain. Thank you. I'm really excited. But it's sales chasing? Is that what it's called?
It's just,
Sales chasing.
Right, so when you do have a sale of a property in a town and you there's a time factor you can adjust so that it's sort of back on par with when the last time everyone else was reappraised. Or if you add, you add something to it. Because otherwise you're now 100% fair market value and other folks in your neighborhood might be at 76%. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
What she said.
Good.
So, yeah, if helpful, I can just sort of show a history of and I admit I have had to do a lot of cramming for this. This is typically done by Chloe Wexler, who is our senior fiscal analyst with Jake, who used to be at Joint Fiscal, so she might be a familiar name to some of you.
And I'm really excited to see you here, Jill, but we were also like, I had a moment of like, I don't think Chloe's been in the committee in a really long time. So thanks for covering.
Absolutely. So we do have a pilot calculation spreadsheet on our website if folks really want to get into the detail, but this was just sort of a helpful summary of where we've been in the last several fiscal years, right? So one of the many calculations that Chloe works on with AOA and ANR are this sort of proration factor. And a lot of pieces go into what the actual appropriation is. So there's an insurance value, there's the CLA, and then there's a proration based on what's appropriated for the pilot payment. So just in the last couple of years, like we're saying, the 100%, so they've been fully funded this year. The estimate that Chloe came up with was similar to Ted's, exactly that it would, she said, just off the back of the envelope, and I think Ted had a more specific example, it would increase the pilot payments by about 3 million. But again, Chloe did create for me a sort of comparison to show you that the CLA is also sort of built into the municipal rates that goes into the pilot calculation. So it's another one of those pieces where you sort of can adjust it here or adjust it here, but the end actual pilot payment is not that different. Like I'm sort of hopping all over the place, but I'm not sure exactly what questions you folks might want to have questions for. That Ted actually addressed also The insurance replacement value, right, is pretty, practically speaking, a pretty good way to do that, right? It's in the state's best interest to have their insurance values relatively up to date. It doesn't rely on, specialized appraisals to be done for those properties. And actually, while we were over there, I was looking up on the Montpelier property records cards to see if the land under here had a value on it. It really doesn't. There's 23 acres in this complex. But the buildings are where the value is because it's exempt. It's exempt as well. So to the point earlier, the pilot payment is not the same as the grand list because the grand list might be the building and land combined, and the pilot payment for buildings is very much building specific. So it's not quite an apple to orange thing. So you do sort of have to have that separated. Yeah, and the examples are, as you pointed out, everything from like lean-tos and Broughton to this building that are separate from the land.
Sorry, you stopped sharing, but there was like a second half. There was, is there any more on why the insurance replacement value is used?
Yeah, so since the state already has to maintain those, that's already information that's available. It's in their best interest to keep it up to date. The towns may not necessarily need to keep those values up to date because it's an exempt property. And there could be pretty significant variation, right? This seems like the most sort of objective and consistent treatment. And there's an analysis that folks from AOA do with their contractor to sort of make sure that that's equitable and statewide. So I do think it's probably the best measure you have because there are state office buildings all over Vermont. You want to make sure that those are consistent if you're applying something like a pilot payment to that reimbursement. Yeah, so the Agency of Administration has an insurance replacement cost contractor that does their assessment management. They review those annually, and then those are fed into the insurance policy and into the pilot payment. And also, when we start to change the CLA adjustment to the pilot, municipal budgets and tax rates are also tending to be increasing. So the CLA also is somewhat mitigated by the increased tax rates that are happening each year for the municipal rate as well. So, sorry.
Yeah, I think, I'm not totally sure what the bigger picture is here, but I would say that on one of Ted's slides, slide number 8 about Johnson, there's kind of 3 things at work. There's the insurance replacement value, there's the muni rate and the CLA. And it led to Johnson getting $47,000 less. And so what happened in that case is they didn't update the insurance value. So it was the same year to year. The muni rate ticked up a little bit, which is normal, but the CLA fell by, I don't know, 10 percentage points or something. So in that case, the CLA dropping resulted in them getting less money. But it's those 3 factors that can result in the town getting less money. Insurance value not moving or not moving enough, the muni rate changing, or CLA. It's the way those are working together.
Okay, so in that example, it seems a little funky. So that if the CLA drops, that implies that real estate values are increasing,
Yeah,
right? And so because the state's building is maintaining the same value, because the insurance value is the same from year to year, it's a smaller percentage of the total grand list, right? If the rest of the grand list is increasing, if it's appreciating. So that's in an environment where the value of the state building is the same, but the grand list is increasing, then the state contribution is actually going down.
yeah, and I'm not an expert on this, but Ted told me before that in that case, it's maybe the responsibility of the college to get that value updated. And maybe they didn't for some reason. And so that's why it's stuck at the same amount year to year. But had they gotten it updated, it presumably would have gone up by some amount.
I just wonder if buildings like those may not have a ready market. So they may not appreciate at all. If
So
anything.
that's why it's not fair market value, right? Because fair market value would be impossible.
Yeah.
So that's why insurance replacement value makes sense as a benchmark. But even with insurance replacement value, because it gets so expensive to build new stuff every year, that should go up every year. And in that case, it did not.
Representative Medlin.
Thank you. Sure. All things said, correct. I'm also aware that the state college buildings and many others, maybe UVM too, I can't say, but the state college buildings, there's zillions of dollars worth of deferred maintenance just because we haven't been able to do that. And so on the one hand, we could say these buildings are appreciating, but if you look beneath the covers, it's like, geez, I don't think so. I mean, there's just so much to do with some of these buildings. So I'm not quibbling with any of this. I'm just adding this as for our discussion. So we understand where we are.
I think in the last presentation, there was a $750,000 cap.
For UVM.
That's, yeah, of course. So, and that's for all the buildings, or is that per building? I don't have it in front of me, so I can't read.
Pilot payment for Burlington.
All, for all of UVM buildings, there's a cap.
Yeah.
750.
I have one more thing to share.
Yeah, no,
It might
please.
open a can of worms.
So, I mean, we're.
It's already open.
I'm thinking of this as like the compost week, so.
Okay.
So trying to figure out how Johnson could not have a decrease. What would have to change in the formula?
The insurance values would need to be reassessed.
So the
regularly.
percentage of the grand list would stay the same.
Right. Yep.
All right, so this is,
Which is a conversation with AOA.
I don't know. Those values, that can be reviewed myself.
I don't know.
Okay.
Those values are provided by the state college system to AOA. So I don't know the mechanism by which those would be updated more frequently, but
Oh,
yes, it's not the AOA's contractor specifically delivering those values.
Okay, so
that's confusing.
AOA does some of the values, but there are other state-owned properties that are not AOA managed valuations. Is there a list of that somewhere? Is there anyone?
I'll check in with Chloe.
Cool, thank you. Okay.
Yeah, that's.
Jill, tell us about your can of worms.
so, so this was something, that Chloe pulled together for us to just illustrate the impact of the CLA on the tax rate and that it basically all comes out in the wash. So, the two sort of factors here to look at, right, are so this is, Berry City's grand list. They last reappraised in 2006. They've now reappraised in 2023. So their reappraisal is, their grand list is this. Tax rate changes significantly, right? Because the reappraisal has happened. So their tax rate is not needing to be as high. This is the municipal tax rate. The municipal taxes collected are the same. The assessed value for the building is the same. CLA is different, right? Because this is now reflective by a new tax rate. So the state-owned municipal grand list properties adjusted by the CLA are different. Then the delta of that, the different rate, the pilot payment is off by about, this is $13. So just to, and again, this might be a can of worms and I might be getting myself in over my head, but the idea being that the municipal tax rate is impacted by the grand list as well. And so when your grand list is updated, your tax rate can go down. The pilot payment doesn't change significantly. Just a way of sort of calculating that that's baked in there already and that it's not an apples to oranges thing. If you just remove the CLA, it's not necessarily solving the problem.
In that example, or just for giggles,
Can you keep it up?
Oh, yes, I'm
that'd be great.
gonna regret, sure.
Yeah, maybe.
It's a great example.
And in that example, the value of the state-owned additions to municipal grand list is 145 million, basically. Divided by the total grand list of 18, of 10 million, right? No, what's the total grand list on that?
6.5.
Unlock the columns.
I'm sorry.
Okay, no, and the first one, $145,000 state-owned addition to municipal grand list on line 7.
Yeah.
Which is F. So 145 divided by 5,042, I think. Sorry, that's 2.8% of the grand list. Versus, I bet it doesn't change much, 189 divided by 6,580.
Can you explain to everyone what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm trying to see if in the new calculation, if the state-owned buildings still comprise the same percentage of the grand list, and they do, because they've been increased in value. They
Right,
have
so
not.
The CLA
Yeah,
was 76.
right.
It's 100. I think it's important to remember too, right? The number for the pilot is not the same as like an assessed value on which you're paying property taxes. It's meant to sort of keep the municipality whole, but it's not meant to behave the same way as like I have, sir.
Yeah. Okay, I got lost.
Okay, any further words? Okay. This is very helpful. Thank you. Anything else from either of you?
Like I said, I feel like I might have just set us back a little bit, but I hope that was helpful.
That was really helpful.
Okay.
Okay,
One more question.
yes.
Do you know of any other towns that received pilot payments that also had decreases in payments from 2024 to 2025, or?
I think Waterbury did.
It seems possible. Again, you know, you have the three factors: insurance replacement value, muni rate, and CLA. And if the CLA is really dropping quite a bit and the insurance replacement value is not coming up and the muni rate is same-ish, you could see that happen. So I don't know offhand, but I think it's possible given what's been happening with CLAs the past few years.
I would add to the CALIP program, the Commercial Appraisal and Litigation Assistance Program that was passed. So a lot of the takers of that, which is basically a program that's place for PVR to assist municipalities in valuing, you know, sort of unique or high value or different commercial properties. A lot of the takers are closed private colleges. And so it's going to be kind of an interesting thing to come back. Like they are not necessarily increasing in value the way that single family home might. They're actually very complicated to value. They're not necessarily a high demand property. So I'll be curious to see what we come up with on that and I'd share that with you. But I think it's sort of good to keep in mind, right, to your point, Senator Maslin, like the value of some of these properties that can only be used for one thing and that might be, you know, 50 years old. There will have to be some work involved to make them valuable.
Thank you. Thank you both. And I think we're going to see you again tomorrow or Friday, Joe. Okay, thanks. Becca Washburn, hello.
Hello there.
Hello, thank you for joining us here in the Ways and Means Committee. I don't think you've been here with us before.
Thank you. I appreciate being invited.
We are sort of wading our way through essentially how pilot payments are calculated. And your side of the equation is very interesting to all of us. And so we'd love to hear a little bit from you, big picture, and then I think we have some more specific questions that came up before you were able to join us.
Lovely. So for the record, my name is Rebecca Washburn. I am the Director of Lands Administration and Recreation with the Forest Parks and Recreation Department within the Agency of Natural Resources. And one of the responsibilities of the division is to be the record keeper and essentially the housekeeper of all of our lands administration responsibilities across the agency. So while I'm situated in the Forest Parks and Recreation Department, when I'm speaking specifically about something like pilot, I'm talking about our land ownership across the agency. So Fish and Wildlife's ownership as well as environmental conservation. So that's a quick introduction to who I am. I also, as you suggested, I did jump into the testimony a little bit late, and I'm coming into this. This is going to be a really good pop quiz for me.
Always ideal.
I'll do my best to answer questions. I also, over my shoulder, you can see Niels Reinhardt. He is the one that does really the due diligence But we wanted to take a team approach to answering any questions that you might have about the way we run our program here for the agency.
Thanks. I think the first question was from Representative Feltus. If you want to ask it yourself, or I can do it, Representative Feltus.
Yes, Marty Phelps from Linden. My question was, it was described that the ANR pilot money was for acquisitions for conservation, to cover land that was acquired for conservation purposes. My understanding had been that it simply covered all lands that were owned by ANR, not necessarily those that had been specifically acquired for that purpose. Is that correct, or am I misunderstanding?
Rep. Feltus, you are correct. The way that we calculate this on an annual basis is essentially cumulative. So when we're looking at the portfolio of lands that we own in fee, which means, we own the underlying land ownership. So an example in your neck of the woods might be Jay State Forest or Linden State Forest, those types of properties. We're calculating our pilot payment to municipalities based on the acres that we own in that municipality. However, it changes year over year because we are actively acquiring land around the state and want to make sure that we are reflective of those acquisitions as we make adjustments to those pilot payments annually. Does that answer your question?
Yes, but I guess my other comment was that they're not necessarily acquired for conservation purposes, or is that more just the definition of ANR? If perhaps they're acquired for recreation, or knowing that they're being acquired by the state and they're going to be conserved in the sense that they are going to be not in private ownership.
Yes.
I guess it's a fine point, I guess, and I just wanted to make sure that we were covering all lands that ANR has purchased.
Yes, of course. I can clarify to say, when we're thinking about the pilot payment we're making and reflective of the acquisition activity that we as an agency participate in year over year, it is for the purposes of advancing the missions of those departments within the agency. So it could be a wildlife management area that we're adding lands to. It could be a state park that we're adding lands to. So the land acquisition process happens very thoughtfully and strategically with the participation of municipalities and the governor's administration and such. And when we get to the point where we are acquiring those lands, we might be doing so for a variety of purposes, like you mentioned.
Okay, fine, thank you.
And then the setting of the fair market value of that land, how does that happen?
So this is a great question, and this is part of the reason why Niels is sitting in here with me in case I get it wrong. What I understand is there was an update within the recent past, probably 2015, 2016, where we made adjustments to the way that the pilot payments are calculated. The way that it works right now is at the time when we are acquiring a property, the pilot payment is based on the assessed value and the municipal tax rate at the time of acquisition. That becomes the pilot payment that we make, or added to the pilot payment that we make to that municipality. And that number stays the same year over year until the statute calls upon the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources to consider adjustments to the way we make that calculation. And property valuation and review within the Department of Taxes assists us in determining what that new formula or what that increase would be.
And the statutory language I see regarding sort of advice on how you should make that adjustment is not particularly precise. And so I'm wondering sort of if you have context for the last time you did that, how that process went, and if you're planning on doing it in the near future.
Yeah, so the last time we went through this, and actually the first time we ever went through it, was in 2022. We were actually expected to go through this assessment in 2021, but because of COVID, we sought approval to delay doing that assessment and considering what that adjustment would be. So we went through that process in 2022. And again, worked closely with property valuation and review to determine an increase. And if I had to convey the actual formula in which we settled on, I probably would have to refer to you, Niels, and you should introduce yourself and share your position.
Hi, Niels Reinhardt. I work in the Division of Lands Administration and Recreation, and my title is Lands Administration and Historic Resources Coordinator. So in terms of how, yeah, it's not exactly clear in the statute. We had to work very closely with PVR in 2022 to try to create an equation that would work. And really, the best person to speak to that is Chloe Wexler. She was very, very helpful in that. But the basic idea is that you take the average change in the municipal tax rates over the period that we're making the adjustment for, and they use that sort of average change over that 3 to 5 year period to then come up with the rate, and we then apply that rate to all all parcels that ANR owns in fee.
But then the fair market value piece is not necessarily updated, just the rate is updated?
Exactly, yeah. So once we acquire the land, like we use the fair market value to determine a base rate. But once we have acquired it, that base rate is detached from the fair market value. But we use the adjustment to try to update the rates that we're paying out for each parcel.
Okay, so the base, meaning the sort of fair market value, doesn't change at all. The rate is sort of frozen, but then the rate gets updated. So you're applying sort of a new rate every, say, 6 years to a standing base, even though in sort of normal tax land, the base grows and the rate changes.
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, so the key thing is the idea that the base rate is separated from the fair market value at the time of acquisition. But at the time of acquisition, we are paying in pilot the amount that the town would receive if it was in private ownership.
Okay. And then when you all did this in 2022, did you work from sort of a budgeted amount that you were able to increase the pilot payment to and then work backwards to a rate?
No.
I don't think so. I think
Okay.
The secretary's office business manager generally is playing a leading role in helping us develop the budget numbers for this particular activity. And Neil's work is to inform that budget number. That's what would happen on a typical year. In the case of an assessment year where we're adjusting the rates based on what the statute obligates us to, I would have to check with the business manager to understand what the sequencing was. But my assumption is that we were doing the work to determine what that rate would result in for an increase in pilot payments and then budgeting for the change.
Okay, and are you prepping to do this for next year or the year after?
Yes, my understanding is it's coming up and we will be preparing to do another assessment.
Okay, thanks. Yeah,
Adjustment, sorry.
So I just had two questions. One is, any idea how your acquisition costs compare to what the acreage is valued for land and current use?
Okay, so let me make sure I understand the question. You want to know if the value of the cost of acquisition is different based on whether a unit of land is enrolled in UVA versus one that is not enrolled in UVA?
Yeah, that's about it. Yeah.
That is not a question that I would be able to answer off the top of my head, but it is something that I could likely get a better informed answer from our conservation staff.
Okay, thanks. And I guess the other question is, because acquisitions take a long time in order to set up, just trying to figure out how many acres are currently owned by FPR essentially, and then what do you see on the horizon?
Sure.
Correct.
So right now, I think the rough estimate is, oh, it's not so rough. I have the number right in front of me. It's 727,000 acres. So that's what we own statewide across the agency's ownership. So again, as I mentioned, state forests, state parks, access areas, wildlife management areas, dam sites, the whole range of different ways that you imagine public lands showing up in your town owned by the state. And our
377,000 acres or about?
370,727 acres.
Great.
And again, similar to your question about values, I could look at our year-over-year acquisitions to tell you, sort of generally speaking, the pace of acquisition. We have typically, I can tell you Forest Parks and Recreations off the top of my head, we're typically closing on 3 projects annually. That I would say that that's our average. But as an agency, it's likely larger than that. But that's something that I could follow up and provide you with some more information on.
So when you're closing on a project, it's often, and setting the value forevermore, it's often a gift, right? And so how do you set that value since no one's purchasing it?
So a donation is one of the ways in which we acquire land, but it's not the only way. We're very fortunate that the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board provides us with funding to support land acquisition. So in many cases, we're using the appraised value to calculate the amount that we would be purchasing land from a private landowner for.
The municipally appraised value.
So we use the appraised value. We hire an appraiser and we have an appraiser develop the value for us. And that becomes the basis on which we negotiate an acquisition from that private buyer. They might decide that they want to do a bargain sale where they'll sell it for less than what that appraised value is and be able to consider a tax deduction from the IRS. They might decide to donate it to us, or we could be in a situation where we're paying the full appraised value. We have federal sources of funding that will support us. The Federal Forest Legacy Program is a working forest conservation program that allows us to acquire land in fee or to acquire conservation easements. And then we have the Land and Water Conservation Fund, another federal program that helps us support acquisitions for recreation purposes. So these are all funding sources that we have in Forest Parks and Recreation and to some degree across the agency. Fish and Wildlife has access to another suite of federal funding sources that they can tap into to acquire lands. Donations, again, they're part of the mix, but they're not always part of the mix. And if we were looking to calculate the pilot payment for a donation, again, we're going to the grand list and looking at the assessed value in the same way that we would be doing that for a property that we would acquire in fee with a payment of the appraised value.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great questions.
Anyone else? Thank you so very much, both of you, for joining us and diving into this special little detail.
Yes, of course. And as I said, I'm more than happy to do some follow-up, and I can share some materials through our legislative contact, Kate Eberly.
I'm sorry, I have one more question.
Oh yeah, of course.
The properties that were purchased before 2016, do those also get adjusted every 3 to 5 years, or are they frozen forever?
No, they're also part of the adjustment. And so they were set, in 2016, and there was an assessment that was done of all of those properties, and then we applied a single rate to all of those. I think it was 0.6, I think it was.
Yeah.
That was used that was then applied to all of those properties to create the base rate for anything that was acquired before April 1st, 2016.
Okay, and each of those adjustments, the adjustment that happened in 2022.
Yeah.
Is it a per town adjustment?
No, it's per property.
Per property adjustment, okay.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
We are done for the day. I will see you tomorrow morning to talk about school